In 1998, the Russian ruble lost 70% of its value in a single month. Bank accounts that could buy a car on Monday couldn't buy groceries by Friday. Lines stretched around city blocks as people desperately tried to withdraw cash that was becoming worthless by the hour. Marina Petrova, a Moscow schoolteacher, watched her entire life savings, 20 years of careful saving, evaporate in 3 weeks. Not because she made bad investments, not because she was reckless, simply because she trusted that the currency in her bank account would hold its value. Here's what keeps me up at night. We're seeing 4 of the same patterns today that appeared before that collapse, and before the Argentine peso crisis, and before the Turkish lira crash. Most people think currency crises only happen over there, in unstable countries with corrupt governments. But history tells a very different story, and in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what those patterns are, why they matter to you right now, and what signals you need to watch for. If you want to understand how to protect yourself when the rules of money suddenly change, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Currency crises don't announce themselves. There's no alarm bell, no emergency broadcast. They're like earthquakes. The pressure builds silently beneath the surface until everything shifts at once. The question isn't whether another crisis will happen. History is clear on that. The question is, will you see it coming? Let me take you back to Zimbabwe, 2008. Imagine going to the grocery store with a $100 trillion bill in your pocket. Not a typo, a literal $100 trillion note. That's what Zimbabwean currency became. Prices doubled every 24 hours at the peak. A loaf of bread that cost $1 in the morning cost $2 by dinner. By the end, the government was printing bills with expiration dates because the currency was losing value faster than they could print new denominations. Joseph Mutasa, a retired civil servant, told researchers he took a wheelbarrow to the bank to withdraw his pension and brought the cash home in the wheelbarrow because the money was not worth the bag it came in. This is an ancient history. This was 15 years ago, and it followed a pattern that's repeated throughout history with shocking consistency. Quick note, this content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. Always do your own research and consult with qualified professionals before making any financial decisions. Here's what most people miss about currency crises. They don't start with the currency itself. They start with trust. Or, more specifically, with the slow erosion of trust in 3 critical areas. Let me break these down because understanding these patterns is like learning to read the weather before a storm. Pattern 1, governments spending far more than they collect. In every major currency collapse over the past century, this shows up first. Weimar Germany in the 1920s, Argentina in 2001, Venezuela in 2016, the story starts the same way. The government needs more money than taxes bring in, so they borrow. When borrowing becomes too expensive, they simply print more currency. Think of it like a poker game where one player controls the deck. When they start running out of chips, they just write themselves more chips. At first, other players accept it. But eventually, everyone realizes those chips aren't backed by anything real. That's when the value crashes. The numbers tell the story clearly. According to IMF data, government debt levels across developed nations have reached levels not seen since World War II. The U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio crossed 120% in 2024. Japan sits above 260%. These aren't necessarily crisis levels yet, but here's the thing. The trajectory matters more than the absolute number. It's not about how deep the water is, it's about how fast it's rising. Pattern 2. Central banks printing money faster than the economy grows. This one's critical to understand. Every economy needs a certain amount of currency to function, to buy goods, pay workers, conduct trade. But when you flood the system with more currency than there are actual goods and services, you get inflation. Too much money chasing too few things. Look at what happened in Turkey recently. Between 2018 and 2023, the Turkish central bank increased the money supply by over 400%, while the economy grew by less than 20%. The result? The lira lost more than 80% of its value against the dollar. Families in Istanbul watched their purchasing power evaporate. Retirees on fixed incomes found themselves unable to afford basics. One Turkish businessman described it like being on a treadmill that keeps speeding up. You run faster just to stay in the same place until eventually you can't keep up. The Federal Reserve has balance sheet expanded from under $1 trillion before 2008 to over $8 trillion by 2024. The European Central Bank followed a similar path. Again, this doesn't automatically mean crisis, but it's the same pattern we've seen before collapses. The more they print, the more they need to print to maintain the same effect. It's a trap that's very hard to escape. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Pattern 3 is the one most people never see coming: the loss of confidence in reserve status. For decades, certain currencies have been considered safe. The US dollar, the euro, the British pound, these were the currencies other countries held in their reserves, the currencies international trade was conducted in. But that status isn't permanent. It's maintained by trust, economic strength, and geopolitical stability. The British pound was the world's primary reserve currency for over a century, until it wasn't. In the span of just 30 years, from 1920 to 1950, the pound went from powering global trade to a secondary player. The transition devastated British purchasing power and living standards. Families who thought they were wealthy found themselves struggling. Here's the concerning part. According to research from the Bank for International Settlements, the dollar's share of global reserves has declined from 72% in 2000 to under 59% in 2024. That might not sound dramatic, but remember, these shifts accelerate. It's like trust itself. It's built slowly over decades and can be lost in months. China, Russia, and several other nations have been actively reducing dollar holdings and increasing gold reserves. The World Gold Council reports that central banks purchased over 1,000 tons of gold in 2023 alone, the highest level in decades. They're not doing this randomly. They're hedging against exactly the patterns we're discussing. You might be thinking, okay, but I'm not a central bank. I'm not holding billions in reserves. How does this affect me? Let me show you exactly how these patterns hit regular people. When the Argentine peso collapsed in 2001-2002, losing 75% of its value, it wasn't just numbers on a screen. Carlos Rodriguez, a middle-class accountant in Buenos Aires, had saved $50,000 for his daughter's education and his retirement. The government froze bank accounts. He couldn't access his own money. When they finally unfroze accounts, his $50,000 had become worth $1,200 in real purchasing power. His daughter couldn't afford university. His retirement plans dissolved overnight. This is what currency crisis means in human terms. It's not abstract. It's your savings, your salary, your ability to buy what you need. And here's the thing that really matters. These crises are getting more interconnected. In 1998, the Russian crisis was largely contained to Russia and some emerging markets. In 2008, the financial crisis that started in U.S. housing markets rippled across every major economy within weeks. Today, with global trade, digital money flows, and interconnected banking systems, a crisis in one major currency could cascade faster than ever before. The fourth pattern, and this is the one I find most concerning, is the acceleration of debt cycles. Here's what I mean. Historically, countries would accumulate debt during crises or wars, then slowly pay it down during good times. That cycle would take decades. Now look at the last 15 years. We've gone from one emergency requiring massive money printing to another, with no real period of paying down the debt in between. The 2008 financial crisis required trillions in new currency creation. Before that was fully resolved, COVID-19 triggered even more massive monetary expansion. According to OECD data, total global debt reached 256% of global GDP in 2024, an all-time high. We're not getting recovery periods anymore. We're accelerating the cycle. Think of it like a rubber band. You can stretch it and it snaps back. Stretch it again, it still returns. But if you keep stretching it without letting it recover, eventually the material itself changes. It loses elasticity. And then one more stretch, even a small one, and it breaks completely. But wait, there's something even more important than just knowing these patterns. It's understanding what happens at the individual level when these systems start to crack. Let me tell you about the Iceland banking crisis of 2008. Iceland's three major banks collapsed in the span of 3 days. The krona lost over 50% of its value. But here's the crucial detail. The warning signs were there for those who knew what to look for. Interest rates had spiked to over 15% as the banks desperately tried to attract deposits. The current account deficit had ballooned to over 20% of GDP. Inflation was rising despite the central bank's attempts to control it. Some people saw these signals and moved assets. Most didn't. The difference between those two groups was life-changing. One retired couple, the Johnsons, had converted half their savings to foreign currency and gold 2 years before the crisis. They lost some money, sure, but they had enough to maintain their lifestyle. Their neighbors, who kept everything in Icelandic bank accounts, lost 60% of their purchasing power and had to sell their home. I'm not saying you should panic or make drastic moves based on fear. I'm saying that understanding these patterns gives you the ability to make informed decisions before you're forced into desperate ones. So, what should you actually watch for? What are the real-time signals that pressure is building? First, watch real interest rates, not just the rates central banks set, but rates adjusted for inflation. When real rates turn deeply negative, it means your savings are losing value just sitting in the bank. According to Federal Reserve data, real rates in the US were negative for nearly 3 years, from 2020 to 2023. That's not normal, and it's not sustainable long term. Second, monitor what central banks do versus what they say. They'll tell you everything is under control right up until it isn't, but their actions tell the truth. Are they buying assets, expanding their balance sheets, implementing unusual policies? The Bank of Japan has been buying its own government bonds for years, essentially monetizing debt. The European Central Bank has done similar things. These aren't signs of strength. They're signs of systems under stress. Third, and this one's subtle, watch what the wealthy are doing. Not what they're saying on TV, but what they're actually doing with their money. Track institutional gold purchases. Watch where billionaire investors are moving capital. They have resources to see around corners that average people don't. You don't need to copy them exactly, but when you see major shifts, it's worth asking why. Fourth, pay attention to price changes in everyday goods versus official inflation numbers. If your grocery bill is rising 20%, but official inflation is reported at 3%, something's off. That gap between lived experience and official statistics often widens before crises. The government has incentives to underreport inflation. Your grocery receipt doesn't lie. And here's that third sign I mentioned at the start, the one that concerns me most: the normalization of emergency measures. When central banks and governments start treating extraordinary interventions as routine policy, we're in dangerous territory. Zero interest rates used to be crisis policy. Now they're baseline. Quantitative easing, literally creating trillions in new money, used to be unthinkable. Now it's standard practice. When the extreme becomes normal, you've lost your shock absorbers. The next real crisis has nowhere to go but chaos. Now, I know what you're thinking. This all sounds terrible. Should I be stuffing cash under my mattress and buying gold bars? Not quite. Remember, currency crises are about the relative value of money. Even in a crisis, you need liquid assets. You need to be able to transact. The goal isn't to predict the exact moment of collapse and go all in on some extreme position. The goal is to build resilience into your financial life, so that when shocks happen, and they will, you can absorb them. Here's a framework to think about this: diversification across currencies, assets, and even geographies. I'm not giving financial advice, but the principle is simple. If all your wealth is denominated in one currency, in one country's banking system, in one type of asset, you're concentrated. And concentration equals vulnerability. Some people keep portions of savings in different currencies. Some hold hard assets like property or precious metals. Some maintain bank accounts in multiple jurisdictions. The specific strategy matters less than the principle. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, especially when that basket is showing cracks. The historical record is unambiguous. Every fiat currency in history has eventually lost most or all of its value. The average lifespan of a fiat currency is around 27 years, according to research from Dollar Days and studies of historical currencies. Some last longer, some shorter. But the pattern holds. The currencies we use today aren't special or exempt from history. They're just earlier in their life cycle. That doesn't mean the dollar or euro will collapse tomorrow. It means that viewing any currency as a permanent, unchanging store value is historically naive. The question isn't if these currencies will face major challenges. It's when and how severe. Let me bring this home with one more story. During the 2013 Cyprus banking crisis, the lesson? The rules can change instantly. The systems you trust today might not function the same way tomorrow. That's not paranoia, that's history. So where does this leave us? We're living through the largest monetary experiment in human history. Central banks have printed more money in the last 15 years than in the previous century combined. Government debts have reached levels that have historically preceded major crises. The signals are there, but here's the empowering part. Knowledge is preparation. Every person who understands these patterns is better positioned than someone who doesn't. You don't need to be an economist or a professional investor. You just need to be aware, informed, and willing to think critically about the systems we often take for granted. Watch for the patterns we've discussed. Build resilience into your financial life. Stay informed about what's actually happening, not just what official sources tell you is happening. And remember, every major crisis in history created both devastation for the unprepared and opportunity for those who saw it coming. The next currency crisis won't look exactly like the last one. They never do. But the underlying patterns, the excessive debt, the money printing, the erosion of trust, the acceleration of cycles, those repeat with remarkable consistency. You're now among the small percentage of people who actually understand what to watch for. Use that knowledge wisely. If this changed how you think about money and financial security, you need to watch my video on what happens to different assets during currency crises, because understanding the problem is just step one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. We uncover these patterns every week, giving you the insights that mainstream media won't touch. See you in the next one.